Hi, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I'll be talking about ups and downs. Not exactly like French cancan, but it's a pleasure to be here today at the conference. I'll make one small disclaimer. I hope there is no correlation between my presence in companies and the ups and downs I witness, but you never know. I do think one of the key things I'll be talking about today is really the sense of time horizon. I personally started my career in 2001 at a great time. I was actually doing my internship in Canada, came back to get my visa in France, and the contract was rescinded. So for people that are maybe starting their careers now in a cycle that is slightly less positive than the last 10 years, economic cycles happen. And I do think that we tend to be, as human beings, very focused on the headlines that are made to be clicked on. And if you look at unemployment, obviously, is just one of the metrics. But there are cycles in your career, and I think we need to be able to leverage the learnings. You learn actually a lot more in cycles that may be a bit less positive. I do think that in terms of putting things in perspective, which we are not naturally inclined to do, if you look at some of the tech layoffs that we've been talking about or reading in the press, and sorry for sharing the same bias of talking about mostly big companies. The numbers are maybe more available, more reliable. These are the layoffs. So it's like really, really concerning some companies like Meta losing 20,000 plus people. But if you put things in perspective on versus what they hired during the pandemic, you get a totally different picture. So ups and downs is as much about how you've hired than how you manage your company, the metrics you look after. I think if we relate to maybe more the French ecosystem, I think there were news recently that year to date, maybe between 3,000 and 5,000 jobs were lost. But again, in the last 2 years, net is extremely positive. And think about where all these people that may or will be laid off are going. They are going to auto manufacturers, to Walmart, Carrefour, and other companies. So it's also part of spreading the tech ecosystem in a much larger scale. And maybe one last point is, there is one metric that in the last 10 years, maybe companies have looked at less. It's essentially revenue by employee or equivalent, right? If you work in B2B SaaS, it's ARR per employee. I do think that some of these companies would make most people in the room quite envious. When you raise metrics of 1 million per employee, it means that you've not exactly mixed up top line growth with headcount growth, which I think is a very, very important part. Now, I want to hear about you a bit and the experience you've had. How many of you have experienced revenue growth in the last 3 years that was north of 50% per year? Can you raise your hand? Okay. I thought there was more scale up and high growth companies right now, but that's fine. How many of you have experienced headcount growth at your companies of 2 or 3x in the past 3 years? Okay. So you understand what it means to scale organization and the difficulties that come with it. And how many have experienced layoffs, not personally, but in your company, in your direct environment in the past year? Okay. And now maybe a more difficult question. How many of you have experienced that at least 2 or 3 times? Okay, so we have like 10, 15 people that everybody should talk to after, because they likely have a bit more experience. And I think the point is, as human beings, we need to be very focused on the direct past, very short time span. And when you go through your first experience, whether it's anything in terms of scaling, downscaling, adjustments, you clearly learn a lot. The second time always feels a bit different. I do think context matters. So whatever I share today, I would say that yes, there are playbooks, but it's about how you contextualize your experience. Every company is different. I had the chance to work in quite a few different companies. These are some of the, I would say, filters that I think you need to keep in mind while I share my context. There are many more. I do think that if you work in B2C and I don't know, the vast majority of your traffic comes from SEO and you're maybe more subject to fecal algorithm changes than if you work in B2B. So those things matter in how you approach the context, how the cycles work, and especially how I think we all have witnessed a certain level of time compression. If you think of how we behave professionally and personally in the last 10 years, time is accelerating and we're actually part of the problem, maybe part of the solution as well, and we need to zoom out. But I do think it's really important to have some of these things in mind because, again, my context may not be always your context. This is a famous climber, Angela Eiter. She did the first 9B, and the angle is actually real. Can you think of the level of training, the level of practice that she had to display to go through? And it's a bit like if you think maybe as a product people of a big problem you have to tackle, what's usually the best way to do it? It's to split it in smaller pieces, smaller chunks that are digestible, that you can really climb, right? So if you have a big mountain that may be very overwhelming, think about the level of training. And those people have a very different level of risk appetite that we have the chance to have. I think, at least I never worked in companies that build rockets or work on, I don't know, medical devices. We have the affordance of making mistakes. And I think it's really, really important that we never forget that, because the key is how do you accelerate the learning culture, right? I don't know how many of you have ever done a pre-mortem before a project, thinking about the mitigation plan of what could go wrong, how you address it. But I would encourage you to think about those rituals that, we tend to do more post-mortems than pre-mortems. They are as important. This is to really foster a culture of learning. And in terms of frugality, which I think is a word that obviously is becoming a bit more fashionable than in the last 10 years, like, think of these people. Like, they have really the least amount of things needed to achieve their goals. And maybe that speaks to you in the current environment that is clearly not as dire as people think or say. But again, we have that sense of short time span and short time horizon. Now, I may share some tips and learnings related to my own experiences. Most of them are cliche, by the way, but the good thing with cliche is very few of us actually do these things properly. So you may be familiar with type 1, type 2 decision framework, not the Daniel Kahneman one, the one from Jeff Bezos, actually. How do you spend your time? And that may be slightly different, I would say, as leaders, as product managers, as designers. But I do think this is one of the most important piece of advice or framework that you have in mind when managing your day. There are very few decisions that you face or that you have to deal with in companies that are so-called type 1 decisions. Irreversible. You open the door, you close the door, you cannot come back. This may be, I don't know, buying a company, launching a new business line, even things that we think are irreversible, like, I don't know, pricing changes, actually mostly reversible. And if you analyze how you spend your day, at whatever level you are in your company, doesn't matter. Do you think you follow that divide, that split? We tend to be absorbed by the day-to-day so much that if you had to measure your time, you would likely spend equal amounts on many, many topics, reversible or irreversible. So I think it's really always important to ask that question for yourself, but also challenge your teams, right? Like, this is part of the empowerment, by the way. If you ask anyone in your team how they spend their time, and do they spend more time on irreversible decision or helping you frame irreversible decision, you'll get usually good outcomes. One thing that is, I think, again, obvious, but I would challenge many of you to consider whether you do it or not, is, especially in maybe more difficult times, how do you spend your time with your players? There is a natural tendency to spend time roughly equally again with many, many players. You want to be present. That's natural. But there are many ways to be present. And I do think that overspending time with key players is one of the best things you can do for your team. Top players would rarely ask your time until it's actually too late. And you can create a certain level of emulation also in displaying how you spend your time with people. It's really, really important. I'll give you two concrete examples from maybe in terms of sharing more context with key players. And some may speak to different part of the audience. There are moments in time where, for instance, when I worked at Yale Street, a fintech company in the US, we had to consider strategic options, either buying companies or partnerships. This is a very sensitive topic. Yet we had created a team that was not directly related to the org chart or the hierarchy. It was like not just a core leadership team. We also had ICs where we decided actually to go deeper and share. These are the sectors and the options we're considering. Super, you can argue, confidential information. We spend the time to give them perspective because there was a time where I would say, like during COVID, maybe the level of uncertainty was higher in their head. With others, it may be, hey, I'm going to spend more time to actually discuss how my BSPCE or options are doing. Because when you're witnessing valuations from 2 years ago and you're asking yourself question as a senior IC or manager, this may be more important. And it may not come naturally. I'm just giving examples that I've witnessed in organization or that we did, but you can think of your own experiences and what context matters for which person. Your top players need a certain level of context, mission, and other elements, but then they need to listen to something that speaks to them. So you need to understand that. Now, I think hieroglyphs is maybe a very dangerous metaphor because some people have still difficulties deciphering them. But I do think that it's a metaphor for how do you communicate to different people in a different way. How many of you as product people or designers have had the frustration of, hey, I've said that. Not once, twice. And they did not get it. And you're like, yeah, I've delivered the same message. So I do think it's like repeat is super important, but repeat with context, with translation. I'll give you a very, maybe a recent example from Payfit. We had the unfortunate event of having an outage end of March that was actually pretty significant, that affected our customers and actually affected the morale internally, right? And there is always, when you're on the front lines in, let's say, customer service, you may have a very different perspective than when you're in sales. And so we spent a lot of time creating, like, first documentation explaining what happened, but then very dedicated meetings, 2 different teams. Did I deliver the same information factually? Absolutely. Did I deliver it in the same way? Do I consider it was worthwhile investment to do maybe 7 to 10 meetings on the same topic? Yeah, absolutely. So think about challenging yourself on how you communicate, which angle do you use, what convinces people what they want, not what they want to hear. It's not about I said totally different things in different contexts. I said exactly the same facts. I just presented and extrapolated them differently for different audiences. And especially in uneasy times, think also about how you present your roadmap, right? Like if you all believe still that there is only one way to present your roadmap from the board to the CEO to your team, then I'm sure you can ask feedback to your stakeholders about that. One thing that happens in maybe difficult times, and you may have experienced that also in the phase of high growth, is stability or lack of stability of KPIs. At least personally, I've worked in companies where there was a set of KPIs, usually not really ranked, which is actually one of the most important things in KPI definition. And then things went well or did not go well, and I heard, oh, I think the KPI was not the right one. We should change it. That's usually a huge fail, right? I mean, I'm not saying we should never change your KPIs, but I think at the time of debates between, let's say, growth and profitability, which to be honest is like a meaningless debate. There was always that debate. It's just that the ranking was different. And then the question is like, I think you're all diligent enough to know that you need to go into the details, right? Oh, if I do 30% growth, what is acceptable in terms of EBITDA loss in the phase of the company I'm at versus at 20% versus at 40%? And you need to challenge also not just yourself, but I think the management of the company to have that idea of a prioritized set of KPIs and a relation between them. Think about your own, I would say, epic definition. I always ask my team to write a 2-pager about most things we do and to have a set of measure of success, hypothesis, but primary and secondary KPIs. It's really, really important to have a sense of what is your primary KPI versus secondary. And primary, there should only be one. There's no debate about that. So I do think that you have to think about also how you communicate those things clearly. At various companies, we made sure that there was a lot of time spent on accessibility of these things, but then how you relate them to your mission statement and so on. You know that numbers is not just what motivates people, it's just outputs usually. So you need to think about that really, really importantly. Now, something that obviously is, is hard is how do you create an environment where I know there's a lot of talk about resilience, but in the end, as human beings, you naturally fear certain moments, right? When you know that the company is doing less well, maybe when the growth profile evolves, when you know that, oh, we stop hiring or we may have to let go people, how do you manage those situations? And I do think it's like a goal, right? In terms of psychological safety. In the end, you're not, as a manager or as a person, you don't necessarily understand exactly all the behaviors of everyone in your team. So how do you create that environment with that objective of creating psychological safety? I'll give you maybe 2 examples. When I worked in New York in a fintech, the private markets after COVID basically behaved in the following way. The private markets mean anything non-public markets, which is actually way bigger than public markets. They were priced, the assets were priced at the level of pre-COVID, yet on the B2C side, on the consumer side, people stopped investing. They were afraid, right? So can you imagine the imbalance? So we had to do layoffs, roughly 10-15% of the staff. Hard to do. It's about how you do it. Obviously, we were careful about certain things. We did one key mistake because of things people should not be doing, because 4 months after, we actually, again, did a round of layoff of 5%. But here is the thing that was clear to us. When we did those layoffs, apart from helping everyone get a job quite fast, we said, these are the metrics. This is why we're doing it in terms of that discrepancy between the price of the assets and what people see. These are the indicators we're looking. This is the rank of the indicators. And we know that we have made a decision that hopefully is valid enough for 6 months, but in 3 months, we'll do a check-in based on this and these indicators. You can think about it in 2 ways, right? Some people said, oh, like 3 months ahead, we have that huge stress. But we created context. We accompanied people. And yes, it was not easy to make a second decision. We wish we had more information and better context. But it was like people knew it would never be a second big adjustment, right? So I'm giving you examples that are maybe not easy, that creating psychological safety is always difficult in teams, but think about how you apply that in your own context. Now, I think something that is, I worked in companies that have hired a lot. I've worked in companies that I've hired quite reasonably, and I've worked in companies that had to do scale downs, closure of sites, whatever you can think of. One of the key questions I always ask my teams is, okay, like you just have 1 hire this year. Do you still hire that person? And if you think of your own experience, are you better after 100 interviews than after 5? Obviously, right? Do you have diversity in your interviewer panel to understand how you can either raise the bar, keep the culture, etc. And now the key question is not just, would you hire that person if that was the last hire? Because it's like constraints actually give you a lot of food for thought. For me, the best question is, do you think we should be the team that should get the last hire of the company? Like, it's pure altruism, but how many times when you ask those difficult questions, people tell you, you're right, actually, you know what? That team should have the one last hire. It would be much more productive. It would actually help our teams even better than to hire supposedly according to a specific budget. So I think it's really important. The Mario Bros analogy, obviously, hiring people is a lot more diverse than playing a game. But think about how you assemble your teams, right? It's also about the diversity of your teams to get different perspective. But again, we've hired maybe tens or hundreds of people. When you hire at scale in a I would say growth phase, you definitely lower the bar. So think about how you keep the bar, which is very, very hard. We had at SoundCloud specifically like a bar raiser person that was always outside of the hiring team. And they were like, we had 10, 15 people identified in the company that were just better at interviewing and just at that very, very narrow focus on will they raise the bar of the company? And I do think it helped. Now, in maybe not so easy moments, you have to think also about, like, we all focus, our brains are absorbed by the day-to-day, by the challenge. Personally, I have a hard time celebrating success because I'm always thinking about, like, oh, what's next? But think about who in your team is better than you at creating that energy, at spreading that energy, right? If you think of people surfing, obviously, you leverage the wave. You actually may be pleased by people surfing the wave you did not catch. It gives you a good feeling. Some of the things that we've been doing in many companies I worked at is very like organic ways of 2 or 3 people in teams are always better at creating that feeling, at spreading that good news. Whether it's Friday Slack threads about good news, a lot of people may repeat the good news. You may be aware of it. You'll always get energy, though, from spreading it and discovering how good news calls on good news. So really think about that. Even in the, I would say, difficult moments, it's not just about what you shipped, about the impact it had. It's about which learning did you have. Again, going back to the fast learning culture, how many of you share learnings from the challenges or even the successes you have versus pure like outcomes, numbers, customer impact, etc. So really think about that. And going back to the topic of time, I'll share maybe two diverse experiences that hopefully will make you think about how you manage time and time horizon in your different projects. So that was a few years back, and sorry, you cannot really read it, but I'll tell you what it is. I was working at Nokia Maps, since now it's spun off. It's called Here Maps, and we had a small teams that was working on a mapping application, coded in HTML5 for browsers. And that was a time, if you recall, where Apple wanted to essentially go a bit independent from Google Maps dependencies, started to launch and work on their Apple Maps product. They launched. And this is essentially a press release with Tim Cook apologizing for the poor quality of the first version of Apple Maps and recommending 4 competing softwares, including the ones we were developing. There was a team of 5, okay? That was because that was not the core of the company. We were like within Nokia developing for Nokia, and we had this side project. I'm not celebrating very often, but even then, I celebrated a bit. I was like, you feel pretty good about that. But what matters is not this, is what happened after. It's really, we celebrated too fast. We did not think of like, okay, what are the next moves? Let's do a pre-mortem of how they will react. And so my point here is 3 months later, we had invested a bit under the radar on these projects. got a very proud moment. But in the end, it's a total failure. Like, Apple Maps obviously invested a lot. Their V2, 3 months after, essentially killed us. And that moment is long forgotten. I just thought about it for this conference. But my point is, you really think about the time horizon. And I'm taking maybe a failed example to make you think about, yes, you should celebrate, but what are the next steps? How will you drive differentiation and so on over the long course? Another example maybe from my time at SoundCloud. So I joined SoundCloud after the company existed for 5 years. Started to be successful in terms of millions of active users, but zero monetization, which obviously maybe speaks to you for some companies in the current economic cycle. And after a few months, we looked at, okay, we had this literally one, I don't know how many of you worked in companies that created a lot of slides. I did. We had this one press monetization. I was like, I refuse to create any other presentation on monetization, a new topic, than this one press. And that one press was maybe, I don't know, 70, 80 slides, but it doesn't matter. There was that one slide that mattered most. We had to think about how to create monetization, touch all the systems, think about the trade-off between what do we do for listeners, which in the end brings monetization, what do we do for advertisers, which were never considered, for labels, which we had never considered, for publishers, which we did not know existed, and for creators to give money back, which was the original mission of the company. That is literally the one slide that kept the big picture for everybody in the company. I could speak like 3 hours about that one slide in the details of what do we need to do on the player of SoundCloud, which tracking do we need, what level of changes do we need to do on the front end, on the back end, like hours, okay? That's not the topic for today. It's about this one slide is what created actually the clarity of the context, the clarity of the dependencies, of the systemic dependencies, and what we need to achieve over 12 or 18 months. And in the end, we did it. And the beauty is, with some quirks along the ways, right? Label negotiations are not fun for anyone who worked in media. Many of the people, of the 30 people in the room, in the core team that was working on this, for sure, there were many people that were like skeptical that we would achieve that in 12 or 18 months. But we could always come back every time we were doing something to that one slide and check, does it fit that objective in terms of value exchange, in terms of dependencies and so on. So I really think it's, and people remember that time as like one of their proudest moments in their careers in terms of launching products with lots of dependencies and trade-offs. So I think to conclude, I hope I talked about a few things that you can relate to either as leaders or even as product managers early in your career. I do think that all the things you have to think about individually, but also how do you leverage the power of your team. As leader, you obviously have a bigger responsibility to set the context, to communicate more clearly, but all these things apply to you as individuals. Leveraging the power of the collective. In maybe uneasy moments, you need a bit more confidence and character than in easy times. And it's a tight balance between sharing the confidence, but also having enough vulnerability that you create that relationship and that safe space with your team. So to conclude, I think a sentence I personally relate to a lot as leader is from John Kotter, obviously one of the guru in management from HBS. They don't make plans, they don't solve problems, they don't even organize people. What leaders do is prepare organizations for change and help them cope as they struggle through it. Thank you.